What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another short video looking at some tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. In this video, we're going to rewind back to some really basic stuff and talk about ISO speed settings and auto ISO. So if you're looking for this in the menu, you want the Shoot To menu, ISO speed settings. It has a little camera icon in front of it. In that menu, there are 4 sub-menu entries, if you will. 2 deal with the manual control of ISO, so what you would set manually on the camera, and 2 deal with auto ISO for the R5. So the first menu entry is ISO speed, and this is essentially the menu-based method of changing the ISO. You're probably not going to use this. It sets, as I said, the camera's current ISO, and normally you're going to set that using the second quick control dial, possibly the MFN button with a function there, or potentially, through the touch screen by touching the ISO entry at or option button in at the bottom of the touch screen. So this isn't going to be something that you're probably going to use an awful lot, but this is where that setting is expressed in the menu of the camera. The second entry is ISO speed range, and this controls the range of ISO values that you can select manually when you're changing the ISO. So by default, your camera will come configured with the lowest speed that you can select is ISO 100, and the highest speed that you can select is ISO 51200. And you can adjust those values in this menu up or down to your liking and need. This is where, if you want to enable the low or ISO 50 equivalent or high or ISO 102,400 equivalent, you can go in here and you can enable those 2 ISOs to give you the full expanded ISO range of the camera through your manual selection. But also you can limit the range that you actually top out at or bottom out at to what is what needs or what your needs are. So, for example, if you know that due to the type of photography you do, you cannot exceed ISO 12,800, for example, because beyond that, the noise and image quality is just too low for the work that you're producing, you could set your highest available ISO speed to 12,800, and that would keep you from being able to pick something that was would produce unusable results for you. So that's what that's about. The third menu entry and fourth menu entry relate to auto ISO. So the third menu entry is auto range, and this controls the range of ISO values that the auto ISO system can select from when it's enabled. Now, couple of caveats here. Auto ISO on the R5 and every other Canon camera that's currently in production cannot include the expanded ISO ranges. So you can't use low or 50 equivalent or high or 102,400 equivalent on the R5. So you're limited to that 100 to 51,000 ISO range. Second is the settings that are the ISOs you set here are not limited or do not interact with the ISO speed range that you set in the previous entry. So if you capped your ISO speed range at, say, 12,800, but you left the auto range going all the way to 51,000, then the auto ISO will be perfectly happy selecting ISOs above your manual ISO speed range cap or below, depending on how you set it. So these are auto range, the range you set in the auto range and the range you set in the ISO speed range are independent of each other. The final setting in the ISO speed settings menu is minimum shutter speed, and this is again for auto ISO. And you have 2 options broadly here, manual and auto. So for manual mode, first of all, minimum shutter speed applies when you're shooting in program or aperture priority. When the minimum shutter speed is set to manual, you are specifying the shutter speed that the camera can use, period, end of story. So the range available is 1/8,000th of a second to 1 second, and it's available in 1-stop increments. And so you would use this if you knew, for instance, that you must have 1,000th of a second or faster shutter speed for sharp images, say due to subject motion. you could set 1,000th of a second here and your camera to auto ISO, and it will ensure that you will always get 1,000th of a second or faster. Now, if there's a lot of light, it'll go fast. It'll let the shutter speed go faster. The second option is auto. And auto is where the camera calculates the minimum shutter speed based on essentially the hand-holding rule of thumb and the current lens's current focal length. So if you have a zoom lens on the camera, it doesn't just pick a focal length, it actually uses whatever the lens is currently zoomed to. Additionally, auto mode takes into consideration whether you have turned the 1.6x crop factor mode on in the camera. So if you have it turned on, it increases the shutter speed requirements by about 60% or 1.6 to compensate for the narrower angle of view and the way that amplifies or magnifies the appearance of camera shake. Now, there is a tunable for auto, and the tunable is that auto can be adjusted plus or minus 3 stops in whole stop increments. So as I said, it's calculated based on the hand-holding rule of thumb. You can then say, I want to make sure that my shutter speed is up to 3 stops faster than that always, or up to 3 stops slower than that always. Now, unfortunately, the one option that really would be nice to have here, it is missing, and I'm not sure that any other brand actually implements it either, is to have an auto mode for when you have image stabilization turned on and when you have image stabilization turned off. So, to give you an example of why I say this, and to give you an example of how I have set up auto ISO on my cameras, on my 5D Mark IVs, because of the resolution and because of my own level of stability, and because the sensor does not have in-body, or the camera does not have in-body image stabilization, so therefore when I'm using a non-stabilized lens, I get no stabilization, I have my auto ISO set to be a minimum shutter speed to be a stop faster than the hand-holding rule of thumb would prescribe. On my R5, because it has in-body image stabilization and therefore all of my lenses are image stabilized to at least a few stops, at least a reasonable level, I have changed my hand-holding or my auto ISO min shutter speed to be 2 stops under the hand-holding rule of thumb. So essentially what this means is because the camera is stabilized, I get sharp pictures from my lenses, compensating for camera shake all the time, not just when I have a image stabilized lens on the camera. So I can afford to allow the auto ISO to drop the shutter speed lower than the hand-holding rule of thumb would suggest. So that would be my recommendation. This is also something so you're going to want to play with this. As I said, there's an interaction with image stabilization that, saves you the ability or gives you the ability to run lower shutter speeds potentially, but you're going to have to find out just how much margin image stabilization gives you or what you're comfortable with. So my recommendation, even though I said I can run my camera at -2 on the auto setting, my recommendation would be to play with it and start off conservatively. And if everything seems to work well at, say, standard setting, try going to -1 and see what happens. So I hope that sheds some light on the auto ISO and ISO speed configuration options. If it did and you found this useful, please consider smashing that like button. Also consider subscribing. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.